Namaste, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are super excited and pleased and honored to have Professor Vamsee Juluri with us today. He is a professor of media studies at the University of San Francisco, and I would say a prominent leading intellectual for our generation. We're very lucky to have him and his work with us. I'm going to start, for those of you who are not familiar with Agastya Gurukulam, I'll give you a quick introduction to who we are. We are a US-based nonprofit educational organization, and our focus is on traditional Indian knowledge systems, including languages like Sanskrit and traditional mathematics, Itihasa, Puranas, and a number of other things. We offer programs for kids 5 to 9 years old right now, and we have four batches today that are offered online. And we have got a tremendous response from kids and parents, but we're obviously looking to grow more and more. We are about 2 years old, started by parents and volunteers. Now, for Professor Juluri, as I mentioned, he has written a number of books, both fiction and non-fiction. Some of that we'll talk about today. And he's also widely published in leading newspapers and magazines and a number of other media outlets around the world. Most recently, he's written a book in it, Kishkinda Chronicles. I believe it's a trilogy, but he can correct me. Today we'll talk about his latest book, but also how it relates to the broader issues that some of us are focusing on, namely, parenting kids, especially in a North American society or a global society when you're outside of India, or even in India for that matter. Also, going to talk about the challenges with education. How do we ensure that our kids are getting good education, right education that's consistent with our values, and also make sure that they get a good appreciation of our languages and heritage. Generational conflict, as kids get older and they go to colleges, they seem to go through a transformation, and some of that has been identified by a number of other authors. So, without much ado, it's going to be a wide-ranging, broad-sweeping conversation. And with that, thank you, Vamsee Juluri ji. So maybe I'll start with your personal journey and try and kind of understand, the career choice you made and how you ended up where you are. So, what made you write? What made you, what led you to being a writer of your fiction and non-fiction books?
Namaste, and thank you to you and Agastya Gurukulam for hosting this talk. And thank you everyone who has joined at the late night in India or fairly early morning here in California, and every time zone in between, presumably. So I'm here to talk about my new book and some of my earlier books. And I write books because that's where I feel most at home, I guess, with myself. That was one of the few things I discovered at a very young age. I seemed to be somewhat good at writing. So when I was a kid, I thought I was going to be the world's greatest cricket player, and then the world's greatest detective and astronaut. No, well, not astronaut. I don't know why. A whole bunch of things, So as I went through many ambitions and dreams, in school, the one thing that somehow I seem to be fairly good at, but which was not very respectable to say, like that I'm going to be a writer when I grow up, that seemed to be something I stuck to, or I'm fortunate, the love and the joy of it stuck to me. But in terms of a personal journey, I did sort of go through a major upheaval in my high school, college days, because when I finished grade 12 and I was wondering what to do, like most Indian parents, my parents wanted me to study engineering and become an engineer. So I joined an engineering college, and then after 2 years, I realized I just couldn't do it. So I quit. Very difficult situation because it meant letting down my parents, letting down our family guru, because that was the time my parents had also become followers of Bhagwan Sri Satya Sai Baba. And so I was, sort of torn between these two very opposite directions in my life. On the one hand, my family finding peace and direction with a guru who was saying many wise things, and at the same time wanting to find my own path in life and not become an engineer. So I quit engineering, and I think the toughest part of it was, in a sense, it was giving up on a dream I had for myself, that I was going to be an engineer and just do some writing on the side. How hard can engineering be? And everything is hard if you want to be good at it, whether it's engineering or writing or or being a homemaker or a home teacher. All of these, the tougher it is for you, the better you're going to get at it. And so that's how I went into writing. After I quit engineering, I began to write in the newspapers. Then I studied journalism in Delhi, and then I came to the US to do my master's and PhD. And so it was in the course of my graduate studies that a lot of interesting things happened to me, I think intellectually, because what I found is that things that seem very, very different from each other don't always have to be polarized, that we can achieve a greater harmony. And so to put it very concretely, I know you're going to probably have more questions on this, but I did my PhD in a university known as UMarks. Okay. Well, UMass actually, but for fun we called it UMarks. It's like the JNU of America, University of Massachusetts. And I thoroughly learned from it. I appreciated what my professors taught me and everything. But at the same time, I also kept reading Baba very seriously, and I began to read a little more about what our own thought told us. And anyway, so all that came together, and then since then I've been fortunate because I've written several books. And I'll just show you the two most recent ones. So this is Rearming Hinduism, which we'll probably talk about a little bit. Yeah. And then this is part 2 of the Hanuman novel, the Firekeepers of Jwalapuram. So I hope to keep writing more and seeing more writers come out of conversations like this.
Thank you so much. No, that's anything you want to be good at is really, really hard. And once you crack it professionally and then you become a parent, then you realize that's the hardest thing ever. So thank you. So in your intellectual journey, whose ideas and works would you say are influenced by most? Historians, dharmic books, maybe writers, philosophers. Who would you consider your major intellectual influences? And not necessarily the ones you follow today, but whose ideas you found either good enough to challenge or good enough to be inspired by?
Wonderful question. So when I was in college, but actually when I was in high school and college, I was reading whatever seemed interesting to me. Well, I guess like most of us, I started with Hardy Boys and Enid Blyton and all that, and then just thrillers and all that. Then when I was in college, I began to really read books, I think, which you could say were about the meaning of life, for lack of a better word. I remember second year engineering, when I finally gave up on studying, my electrical engineering and all these very, very difficult things. I got a book called The Outsider, by Albert Camus. And I was reading books like that, around the time I dropped out, because I really wanted to understand what it all meant, because everything was making me question the situation I was in. But I was reading, books like The Outsider and Catch-22, and I used to read Salman Rushdie. And, so somehow, I was reading interesting books. Then I read a book called Tao of Physics, because that book sort of helped me realize that it didn't have to be a choice between science and engineering on the one hand, and faith and spirituality, as they call it, on the other.
Yep.
Right? That everything was the same. Ultimately, truth and knowledge were the same. Then, when I was in college, is sort of when I was doing my PhD. I read some of the formative books which have been with me a long time. When some of the books in my own field of media studies and cultural studies, those were very useful for me to understand the world. But I was also reading a lot of books by Sri Satya Sai Baba, because until then, those first 10 years, Baba was just like Guru. We went and prayed to him and said, give me this, give me that. Mm-hmm. And in the late 90s, when the internet started, I remember we had this browser called Netscape, and my homepage was the Satya Sai Thought for the Day. And I would read that, very diligently every day. Then I would read his discourses, particularly a book called Vidya Vahini and Jnana Vahini, because he was also an educationist. And in fact, the way my father got engaged with him and his world was that my father was a professor of zoology. He was invited to Puttaparthi to help set up the zoology department there. I remember in the mid-80s, he went 2-3 times. In the beginning, he said, I'm just with the university. I have nothing to do with the, So then the second or third time he went and said, it's real. And my father was a very sober, grounded person, a very, very, devout, orthodox man. And, when he said, he's real, I said, he's real. He said, no, he's God. He's avatar for us. And so, I've written about some of this in a book I'll publish eventually called The Guru Within. So Baba's writings were very influential. And just yesterday, in fact, I saw an amazing thought for the day where he said, the role of education, and I want to share this because, we're all parents and educators here and students. The role of education isn't simply to go from falsehood to truth, but from partial truths to truth. Everybody's in their little bubble, of partial truths, left wing, right wing, Hindu phobic, all that. So I'll just quickly mention 1 or 2 more books, which were very formative for me. This was a book my mother got me about 10, 12 years ago. It's called Satya Sai Parenting. It was written by an American devotee. And I saw it, I was like, okay, But then when I read it, I realized it's very, very interesting because, 2 of the most important things we do in our lives, which is, fall in love or get married and then have children, we do without much reflection, right? Why we do it. And I'm actually reading a lot about that now. So this book really, helped me start thinking about why are we born? Why do we choose to, bring somebody else into the world? So those are the books I'm reading. And one more set of books I just wanted to share. This is my mother's autobiography. It's written in, it's written in Telugu. I can read Telugu, but I'm a bit slow. And this is just a book of my father's poems that we, made together like this and published, nature poems, anti-war poems. And I'm mentioning this because, no matter how many books you read or write, the value that having even a small book from your parents has in your life is tremendous.
Wow, so that's incredible.
And so what I wanted to, just throw out there as a very concrete action item right away for parents, young parents especially who are in our meeting today, start thinking about writing a memoir or at least gathering anecdotes. Okay? Yeah. Your children may or may not be interested right now, but it's worth passing on the stories about how you felt when you were a child, what your parents and grandparents told you. Write down even mundane details, because all the value and beauty and meaning we find for our lives is in the mundane details, So, yeah. And one more book, sorry, I know I'm a guy with lots of books and also.
Please take your time.
Yeah, one more book I actually also want to mention as a very influential one. I read it after I finished my PhD and I came to San Francisco. I was teaching a class on media violence, and that's when the whole 9/11 attacks and all that stuff took place. I began to find a lot of books on Gandhi in the Bay Area, and there was one book in particular, Gandhi's Hind Swaraj,
Right.
which he wrote in Gujarati and English, on the ship, which was very profoundly enlightening to me because, for a long time, when I was doing my PhD, I was reading all the Marxist, academic literature, and I was reading Baba and Upanishads. And so these two things were in my mind. It was like, okay, I see the reason why a lot of young students are influenced or charmed by Marxism, the promise of making a better world, ending poverty, all these things. But I have my little skepticism given its track record. Because I see my guru and people like him whom Marxists hate and despise and say bad things about, actually doing a lot more for the poor, like building waterwork projects, free education, free healthcare, and teaching everybody to live for others, live and serve, love all, serve all that. So, but the book that connected these two very different traditions or streams of thought in my mind was Hind Swaraj.
Yeah.
Because that was Gandhi's vision for the modern world, why we are in the position we are in the world today, and his solution for it. It's a pity that Nehru and nobody else, never really understood that book or followed it. Right. And he has become a figure for all sorts of, problematic forces. But yeah, Parents, Baba, Hind Swaraj are some of the books I would name. And more recently, the Voice of India books.
Yeah, no, those are fascinating as well. I would give a shout out to Sri Balaji, who is the chairman of Agastya Gurukulam, and him and I, when we, when the core group, when we were discussing, what is the idea and vision for Agastya Gurukulam, the first book that he thought was Hind Swaraj.
Wonderful.
As one of the vision documents that we should be inspired by. And, you are absolutely right. Hind Swaraj is a book that everybody in the world, not just Indians or Hindus, anybody, but everybody must read to get an idea of what it means to be sovereign in your culture, in yourself, and in your society, and how do you build it without being colonized mentally or physically by anybody. So Absolutely. Big shout out to Sri Balaji. You nailed it, as Vamsee ji just said. So moving on, we now today you study maybe a somewhat unpopular research topic in the academia. You're a professor of media studies, but your particular interest is Hindu phobia and Hindu studies, and I want to explore that a little bit because the current academic establishment, both in the United States and in India, is very much the leftist South Asian type, which essentially sees Hinduism as a problem. You have picked, therefore, to fight against the academic orthodoxy by choosing the research topic and publishing your original insights that are contrary to, the establishment narrative, so to speak, or the orthodoxy. Talk to me about what it means to you personally, because making these kind of career choices is not easy. And so what does it cost you in personal terms, in career terms, to speak out and stand up for the truth and what you believe in?
So I was going to speak about that, but then, I got so excited that there's so many parents who are interested in topics of parenting and homeschooling and decolonization from a Hindu perspective, not just Hindu survival, but, a better world imagined by Hindu children, our children, So in a sense, I think my attention has shifted more to the reward of speaking out, the reward of being a dissenter, a protester against academic, hidebound orthodoxy, as it were.
Yeah.
So I want to note that really it's the reward we should be focusing about, in the sense that I think the world that could emerge if we had the first generation of really decolonized children, because we are like the second generation of probably post-colonial children, right? I mean, I look at a lot of things generationally. So the next generation, what it could achieve, that's a great reward. But in terms of, the challenges you would face doing this, I can tell you a little bit about some of the challenges I have faced. I think in a way, my limited and slow learning curve, as it were, kept me going for a very long time before the kind of crush or challenges began to really pile up. Because, I started writing about Hindu phobia in the media because I saw it very much from within the logic of my field. Okay. Because in the 90s, early 2000s, I had not read Voice of India. I was not really aware that there was already a literature, of Hindu resistance, honestly. And so I was in academia, and in media studies, we are trained to spot bias, propaganda, stereotypes. And there's a lot of books written on stereotypes affecting different communities. Books on racism, sexism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. And, I was teaching all these things in my classes. And I don't know why, for a long time, it didn't occur to me why there was no book or there were no studies of, our depictions, And then early 2000s, when I began to notice this, and I slowly started writing about it, I think the 2008 terrorist attacks on Bombay and on Mumbai, and how the Western press sort of whitewashed it, that got all my propaganda detection radars, buzzing. So I wrote and I really pushed, and the Huffington Post gave me a column at that time. And I have to think it was, a gift from Goddess Saraswati, because I got a platform when I needed it. And after that, I began to write fairly regularly there about, Hindu phobia and things. But around 2016, 2015, I would say, is when backlash really came. And it's interesting how it happened. So for me, from the time I started writing about Hindu issues and calling out Hindu phobia in academia, particularly in the California textbook issues and so on, till about 2015, I always viewed myself as, an academic dissenting with academia or trying to broaden the conversation. I didn't even see it as a dissent at first. I thought, people will listen to me and, it'll all grow and all that. But then what happened was, it started to change around 2015-16, and a lot of it had to do with the politics in India.
Right.
And both the forces which were hostile to the present government, and I would say the certain, behavioral or perceptual failures in the form of the present government too, because I honestly did not know anything about the BJP or Hindu nationalism or RSS, frankly, till about 2015 or so.
Right.
And when I first read Conrad Elst around that time, I suddenly realized these guys were not fascists, they were like Boy Scouts or something. And for a while, I was like hopeful, that there would be a force for decolonization. But then I think what has happened is within a year or two, that whole possibility that democracy had given for decolonization collapsed. So starting around 2015-16, there has been a huge amount of censorship, outright censorship. So for example, Huffington Post shut down like virtually all the guest columns, they had given. Newspapers in India, which used to, reach out to me and ask me to write for them, they don't want to publish anymore. So I think there is like a major amount of polarization going on, and a lot of it has to do with both the hostility of the dominant establishment and the ineptitude of this sort of chota establishment which they're trying to build in India, I guess.
Right.
But once again, I'll conclude and say on this question, it's there is a lot of emotional and professional risks you take. I mean, one quick example that now comes to mind: during the textbook issue, very big newspaper like the LA Times did a hit job on me. I had written a petition which had gotten 25,000 signatures, and it was making waves, and it was about not changing India's name to South Asia and all these things. But then the LA Times comes in, and so there were times when it was emotionally very, very taxing. But anyway, I guess what keeps me going is thinking of a better future.
Well, you know what they say: if they're not attacking you, that means you're not succeeding.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Great answer.